I'm Valentine Cadieux. I'm the director of the Center for Justice and Law, and we are here in a closed campus. I'm sorry you can't join us in person, and I'm so grateful you could join us online. We're really thrilled to welcome Patty Bourne back from her time at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we're so grateful that she's willing to share her experience with us. And we're so grateful that many of you could join us tonight despite the weather. So thank you so much. Jennifer and Mariah are here with me, and we're going to be taking questions from the internet as well. So you're welcome to put questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll have time for discussion, but we have a much larger community that is able to join us here in the Zoom. So I'm going to start us tonight with Hamline's relatively new land acknowledgement, still in process, acknowledging that the land in which we gather and refer to as Minnesota is the traditional and unceded territory of the Dakota and Ojibwe. We pay respect to the members of not only those tribes, but others as well, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. A land acknowledgement serves as a formal declaration that recognizes and respects the unique and enduring relationship which exists between indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. Making this recognition expresses gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and honors the indigenous people who've been existing with and on the land from time immemorial. This land's long-standing history is significant, as land acknowledgements do not exist in past tense or historical context. Colonialism, appropriation, and genocide have relevant real-time realities. We need to build mindfulness regarding the source of our present land privilege, understand the long-standing history from which it comes, and seek to reconcile our place with both. And as those of you who've joined us for previous events know, we're trying to figure out how we can act on acknowledging this. For example, we're starting a small land fund that we put donation money into every time we give this land acknowledgement. So with this, I think a lot of the questions of the reasons we need to acknowledge land are really bound up in our history that's gotten us to this point with climate change. So thank you again, Patty, for being willing to join us. I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and we have questions for you, but first we'd just love to hear what you have to say about your trip to Egypt.
Sure. Well, thanks for having this event and for doing this. And I'm down the hall from you in my office, so it's nice to see you virtually. And thanks everybody for joining. I'm really honored and humbled to be able to present on the climate conference that I just attended in Egypt. And I'm just thrilled to be able to share some takeaways and kind of overview of what happened and what the event was like, and kind of lessons learned and things I can share about how we can move forward in productive ways in thinking about next year. So I'm really hoping that folks will contribute questions that I can answer at the end. If you want to put things in the chat, that's fine, or I'm not quite sure what the process is. I think, Valentine, is there some link that you wanted people to submit questions?
The chat will be fine. We also have a Slido, but people who are here are welcome to do this, and we can, I think people have seen the Slido. We can put it in a comment on YouTube as well for those.
Okay, cool. Wonderful. Well, what I thought I would do is kind of leading up to the questions, I'll just give kind of a brief overview of what the UN Conference of the Parties is, what is the climate conference, and sort of a little bit of history about kind of how we got to where we're at in terms of the global negotiation process, and then share a little bit more detail about what specifically happened at the conference this year in Egypt. But if folks have specific things they want me to address, please feel free to drop that in the chat or otherwise, and I'm happy to do that too. So I'm going to share my screen here for a second and hope that it works. Let's see. Bear with me. I'm not a Zoom fanatic. I'm much more of a Google Meets person, but I'm doing my best. So here we go. So can you see my screen? It's a timeline right now, or no?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. So this when I was kind of putting this together, there's a really great reference that I'll share at the end that kind of has provided the history of how these UN climate conferences work, when they were, the UNFCCC was established and why. And it made me really reflect on how recent all of this is. So by 1992, when the very first UNFCCC kind of was established and created, I was out of high school by that point. And so I forget how new a lot of this is and how much we've really learned and changed just in recent years. And so just a very quick overview. So the UNFCCC is a body that was created during the first climate summit that happened in Rio in 1992. And this was kind of the first time that parties of the world got together to recognize that we're having, we have some problems climate-wise. We know something bad is coming, and we know that we need to do something about it. And at that summit, then a work group was established to create this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we call it the UNFCCC. So that was officially created in 92, and then it sort of became a thing, an actual body in 94. And then the very first COP, the Conference of the Parties, happened that next year in Berlin. Couple of years after that is when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. That was kind of the first major action of the UNFCCC, and many folks can probably remember when that happened. It was really big news. That was the first time that governments and heads of negotiating teams for different parties of the UN really committed to limiting their fossil fuel greenhouse gas production, with the idea that we all have a responsibility, but that responsibility differs depending on sort of what we've done, how much we've contributed to the problem, and how we're affected by it. So it took some time for that Kyoto Protocol to sort of be written into force. We don't really call it a law because it's not a United Nations law, but it's more of an agreement that holds countries accountable. So that was in 2005. Now in 2012, which is also really recent, that at that meeting, that's when governments said, okay, we're going to do something collectively now. So prior to this, the Kyoto Protocol was more like individual countries saying, yep, we see there's something that needs to be done. We're going to do something. And in 2012, governments really said, hey, you know what, we need to come up with some kind of collective agreement and collective understanding about how we can make progress and move the needle in this way. We have to do something collectively. So that was a really big turning point. Interestingly, in 2014, there was something called the Lima Work Program on Gender that was established, and that was created in response to the fact that I think in 2012 at the COP18 conference, there was something like maybe 12% of the parties negotiating were female or female identifying. And so they created a work program to say, okay, the UNFCCC recognizes there's some pretty extreme inequity here, and we need to be more intentional about being inclusive and having gender parity at this negotiating table. So in 2014, they said, okay, we're going to be intentional about that. That work program was extended in 2016 for 3 more years. And then in 2019, it was extended for 5 more years. So clearly we've still got some work to do in that area. And I think it's just interesting. We keep extending that, which means we're still pledging to be intentional, and yet here we are. So after 2012, 2015 happened, and 2015 is probably something that many people in my generation remember as, like, if you're a climate person at all, this was like a huge, huge deal. The Paris Agreement was unlike anything that the world had ever really seen. It was the first time that all the countries, there are about 198 countries or parties represented in the UNFCCC. And that was the first time that they had all agreed to submit these things called nationally determined contribution, essentially kind of like what their plan is to reduce global warming, to reduce fossil fuel emissions. And so when the Paris Agreement was signed, it was really a really exciting, it was a really exciting time for climate. Now, at that time, scientists were kind of the mind that 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, 2 degrees Celsius was really as hot as we could let it get without really dire consequences. Since then, the global consensus is that 2 degrees is much, much warmer than we can really tolerate. 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming is really the absolute maximum that this planet can take without reaching some, without setting into effect some tipping points that would be very bad. So that was in 2015. A lot of other agreements came from the Paris Agreement, and I'll talk a little bit more about those kind of as we go on, but essentially within that Paris Agreement, not only were the countries committing to submit their NDCs, but they were also agreeing to come back and do what's called a global stock take and to really be accountable to the plans that they made. So Paris really can't really be understated how important that agreement was. So many folks will remember then in with the coming of the next administration after Obama, the US pulled itself out of the Paris Agreement, which was pretty detrimental to our international reputation in terms of climate and climate action. And we actually re-entered the Paris Agreement on day one, the first day that Biden's administration came into office. We rejoined that. That was one of the first priorities that he had. And so we've done a lot in that time to kind of regain some global trust. And I think we still have a long way to go, but it's really great that he allowed, put us back in the Paris Agreement. Despite Trump removing us from the Paris Agreement, the United States and a number of states within the US created their own sort of coalition called the America is All In Coalition. And they basically said, you know what, even if our president is not participating in this, we still really believe in the Paris Agreement, and we're still really committed to making sure that we can do whatever we can to stick to the NDCs and the pledges that were made. So that's kind of how that unfolded. Now in 2020, there was no COP conference, which was the first time since the UNFCCC was established that there wasn't a COP, but that was because of COVID. 2021 was in Glasgow, and I was fortunate enough to be able to attend that one. And coming out of the Glasgow COP, there were some really significant pieces of some pledges and agreements that were made that were brought to bear at this COP, which was this past November in Egypt. So I'll talk a little bit about those too. Okay, let's see here. Trying to figure out now how to move my darn. There we go. Okay, so I talked about what the UNFCCC is, but essentially the purpose of it is really to be kind of the home for the global response to climate change. And some of the content in this presentation has been shared with me by Climate Generation, which I know a number of Hamline folks are familiar with. They're a big partner in the Natural Sciences and Environmental Education Master's Program. They've done quite a bit of work to help us develop our climate literacy certificate, and actually had a lot to do with our course that we just wrapped up on global climate policy and solutions. So essentially, kind of the big picture of what happens at COP is the main purpose of it really is for the parties, so the heads of state and their negotiating teams, to get together and negotiate their nationally determined contributions and make different kind of pledges around what they're going to do to mitigate and deal with climate change. Those negotiations take place within closed door sessions, and up until 2021, a limited number of observers would be able to go in and watch those negotiations. the UN has really got a strong stance around transparency and trying to make the policy process accessible to people. And so that's part of why these COP conferences are so important, because they offer people from all walks of life the opportunity to attend and participate in different meetings and plenary sessions and press releases and negotiate sort of smaller scale negotiations and dialogues around climate issues. In 2021 and this past year, this past COP, no observers were allowed in the negotiation rooms, the high-level negotiation rooms. And the ostensible reason was security, and I'm not sure if that will change in upcoming years, if the UN will kind of revisit that or what will happen. But essentially, there's a process by which you can sort of get a badge to attend these different sessions, and I'll explain a little bit about that. It's a little bit complex, but essentially, so as I mentioned, there's, heads of state and negotiating teams for each party. And they're given badges to attend all of the high-level negotiations. The UN also grants delegate badges to other kind of contingents in society. So there's also non-governmental organizations, so universities, nonprofits, that kind of thing. The press kind of gets its own sort of set of badges, basically, and then different specialized agencies like international environmental law agencies, for example, or unfortunately, a lot of fossil fuel industry and corporate entities are able to get badges to attend also. But essentially, the color of the badge you have sort of determines what you can access and what you can't. So the badge that I was able to get through the school that I work with gives an observer badge. So that means that I can go and observe as many sessions as I want, or as many sessions as I'm able to get into, but that I don't get a spot at a negotiating table. So I can't really speak for universities, for example, in a negotiation around climate education. I can go and watch other people do that and learn from that and contribute, in conversations, but not really be a negotiator. So that's kind of how the badging process works. In order to become an accredited organization, to get badges, an organization would need to, there's a pretty significant amount of paperwork involved, and it's an application to the UN to get accredited. And then each year the UN then decides how many badges to give to any organization. So it's kind of a process every year of not really knowing how many people from any organization can go. So it's a little bit dynamic every year, but generally speaking, if an organization is accredited, they will stay accredited unless something really significant happens. So that's kind of how it works. And then the UNFCCC has kind of designated different regions worldwide, and every year the conference happens in a different region. And this little chart on the bottom gives you a little bit of a picture of where things have happened. So I know one person had submitted a question about who gets to decide what happens at the conference, or what are the items on the agenda that are negotiated. And so I want to just explain, there's the sort of high level agenda, which is the climate negotiations, but then there's also, for the entire 2 weeks of the conference, there's all kinds of other meetings and events that take place. So panel discussions, different countries will have presentations to talk about different things that they're doing to mitigate climate change that aren't necessarily negotiation related, but they're still important and salient and of interest to a lot of people. Then there's also other delegations. So for example, this year there was a youth delegation, which is actually not new. There's always been a youth delegation, but this year the youth delegation had a pavilion. So if you imagine, like if you've ever been to a conference or kind of an expo and you think about the expo hall where there's booths everywhere and, you know, different merchants are talking about their products and giving things away. It's the pavilions are kind of like that, except that they're huge. So like one pavilion, so Egypt, the country had a pavilion, and that was basically a room, probably twice the size of the Center for Justice and Law. So huge. And people could go in and sit down, and there were all kinds of presentations happening all day long related to Egypt and some of the actions that they're taking around climate. So every country has a pavilion like that. And then there are also different delegations, like the youth delegation had a pavilion. There was a climate justice pavilion, which was awesome. There's just all kinds of pavilions of organizations really just trying to do education and kind of help contribute to the space around the work that's happening with climate. So that agenda, each pavilion sort of sets its own agenda, but the official COP agenda is set by the COP presidency. So every year when it's decided who's going to host COP, there's a person in charge of that who's considered to be the president of COP for that year. And that person with their, with help from a team, decides what goes on that agenda. And countries have time, usually quite a bit of time ahead of COP, to suggest items that they want to talk about, and they can prioritize things. So for example, this year, countries would fill out a form basically and say, well, we want to talk about food equity. We want to talk about water scarcity. We want to talk about, you know, whatever, and they could prioritize it. And then the COP president sort of looks over all of that and decides what gets to be on the agenda. Then the president brings that to the parties, and everybody agrees to it. They build consensus around that agenda. And sometimes that happens really quickly. Sometimes it takes a really long time. For this particular COP, it took 48 hours before they could agree on an agenda to get started. Excuse me. And a big reason that it took so long was because of this issue of loss and damage, which I'll talk about in a minute. The idea being that there would be a fund created to support countries that were more vulnerable, that are suffering the effects of climate change. There were a number of countries that were really not open to having that be on the agenda. And that's been something that countries have been fighting for and asking for over 30 years, to get loss and damage on an agenda. Finally, at the end of 48 hours, some of the last holdouts against loss and damage agreed to go ahead and let it be put to the agenda. And so then the agenda was agreed upon and the actual conference started. One thing that was that was really disappointing was that this year they didn't include on the agenda a discussion of specific measures for keeping warming below 1.5. So that was really unusual, because the whole point of COP should be to talk about keeping that temperature down. But the main focus this year was really on more kind of adapting and dealing with sort of where we're at, rather than setting more ambitious targets. Okay, so 1.5, how did that number come into being? And I see that there are a couple of my former students here, so I'm sorry, this is probably repetitive, but bear with me if you will. So as I mentioned earlier, the Paris Agreement was really focused on 2 degrees. We want to keep that global temperature down below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. We've since really learned and developed a scientific consensus that 1.5 is really the absolute maximum that we can handle. Beyond that, we will reach a tipping point that is very bad. Currently, we're at about 1.1 degree Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. So we have a lot of work to do. The good news is that as more and more industries and countries stop using fossil fuels and stop extracting fossil fuels, as soon as that happens, we start to decline in terms of tons of emissions. And so there really is a chance that we can turn this around. If we don't turn this around, and if we hit 1.5, the concern is that we enter into this territory of tipping points. And so tipping points kind of happen at scale. So there are some sort of smallish tipping points that happen that we've all probably already seen. Like here in Minnesota, we know that the forests are warmer all winter long. Sometimes there's less snow, and less snow means there's less insulation for the plants over the winter. And that less insulation means that many of them don't survive. And so we see a difference in the change in vegetation in our northern forests as a result of that lack of snow, which is a result of the warming temperature. So that's a tipping point, but it's not of the scale of what we're expecting to see if we exceed 1.5. So if we get to 1.5, we will expect that some of these things that will start to happen will create a cascading effect that will set into motion some things that are just really catastrophic. I won't go into all the details here, but I know this presentation will be shared. So if you want to look at it more closely, it's pretty interesting to look at. And it really does show kind of the ripple effect of what could happen if we don't get our act together. So all of that being said, I just want to quickly go back and talk a little bit about the COP26 conference, which was in 2021. The reason that I'm bringing that back up is that COP26 was seen as really kind of the last chance. Like, this is it. We've been talking for so long. Now it's time. If we don't really set some specific targets to limit our warming, we've got problems. And this was also the first COP at which the countries were expected to come back and say, we looked at our first NDC, our nationally determined contribution, and we've set some more ambitious targets, and here they are. So COP26 was where countries were supposed to show those new ambitions. The other thing that happened last year that comes to bear on this year is that climate justice has really been a focus of COP for decades. And last year, there was really a strong push. There were lots of protests in the community. In fact, the biggest climate protest ever in history happened last year in Glasgow. And part of that was because people were demanding that the UN and the UNFCCC include loss and damage in their, thank you so much, loss and damage in their, in the agenda. And people were very upset that that wasn't on the agenda at COP26. And we're really expecting that because climate finance was part of the conversation last year, they really wanted to make sure that it happened this year. Climate finance is different from loss and damage because it tends to focus more on like giving a country money to shift to a green energy system. That's all really important. But loss and damage is more, we think of loss and damage as more like climate reparations and an acknowledgement that more vulnerable countries, we're accountable to those countries to do something to repair some of the damage and the loss that we've caused. So COP26 happened. Loss and damage wasn't on the agenda that year, but it was huge this year. We were all really disappointed that loss and damage wasn't there last year, but there were some really good things that happened. There was an Indigenous peoples platform that was elevated to a higher level last year within the negotiations, and so they were given a lot more space to participate in negotiations than they have previously. So that was huge. And then there were a lot of pledges and agreements made by different countries to talk about or to commit to setting aside land, creating some huge marine sanctuaries to reduce deforestation, things like that. So there were a lot of really good smaller steps that came out of COP. But it was not what everybody had really hoped, but it was still progress. The other reason that last year kind of comes to bear on this year is that in Paris, there was a program called the Global Stocktake, which was implemented as part of the agreement. So all the countries that signed the Paris Agreement, which was about 198, said, okay, as part of this pledge, we agree that not only are we going to look at our own mess that we've made as a country, but we're willing to take that information and sit down and look at the collective and say, how are we as the UN, as the world, how are we tackling this problem as a single body, as opposed to just country by country? So last year was phase one of that. That was where each country had to sort of report on its progress, set new targets for itself, and kind of share what we've learned. This year, they started this technical assessment part of the Global Stocktake, which is where groups and subgroups were formed to kind of look at different areas of changes that have, that different countries have pledged to make, and kind of how that's going. Next year, at the next COP, is where sort of that all gets synthesized and put together in a new sort of recommendation of like, here's where we're at as a United Nations. This is what everybody pledged to do and said they were going to do. We know the effects that it's having on individual countries. Now we know the effect that it's having globally. So what are we going to do with that? And so that process started last year, continued this year, and it'll kind of wrap up. This round of it will wrap up next year. Okay, so that brings us to this year. So COP27 was hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, which on this map here on the right-hand side, you can see it's right here. So it's situated right in the Red Sea, which I was able to snorkel when I was there, and it was just mind-blowingly beautiful. Although also kind of alarming because I'm not a coral reef expert by any means, but I could tell that a lot of the coral reefs there were not doing well at all. And this is considered to be really a kind of a global hotspot for coral reefs, I guess. And so it was pretty eye-opening to be able to get in the water and see that. Sharm el-Sheikh as a town is really hard to get to. Took me 3 days to get there, partially because of travel logistical issues, but also because it's a really long way away. And it's not a place that a lot of major carriers go. So it was created some frustration among delegates that it was in such a difficult location. And because it's built as a resort town, the lodging was really, really difficult for a lot of people. And all of the lodging accommodations were required to be made through the Egyptian government. And there were a number of cases leading up to COP where people would make reservations and then either have their reservations be canceled and asked to be rebooked for sometimes triple or even quadruple the amount that they were initially quoted. Other times not even be able to rebook at all. So it was frustrating for people just logistically to get there. Something that was challenging also was that it was, the conference center itself is sort of almost like a mini city created by the UN. It's UN territory within Egypt. So people who are in the conference perimeter are under UN jurisdiction, but if you're outside the conference perimeter, you're under Egyptian jurisdiction. And so Egypt was really excited to host COP and built all kinds of things in order to support delegates and visitors to the conference. So there were a lot of brand new resorts and brand new roads and all kinds of structures being put up even during the conference to sort of accommodate the influx of people, which was really interesting and kind of bizarre. There were a lot of plants, non-native plants brought in and then being watered, like tons of water being used to landscape medians along the side of the road and everything, which just felt very disconnected from the purpose of being there. But it was a very interesting setting for sure. So every year, as I mentioned, the host partner gets to kind of set the agenda based on feedback. And then the COP presidency sort of names the theme of that year's COP. And so this year it's really been called the implementation COP. The idea being that we've spent enough time talking and planning and talking about planning. Now we need to actually implement the stuff we've decided to do. And so there are four main goals that were identified. The first one was mitigation, then adaptation, finance, and collaboration. So for mitigation, one of the outcomes of COP was really to implement the Glasgow Pact. That's the work plan that came out of last year that would really kind of hold countries to account for what they're going to do to take action specifically, and then to establish some really specific targets. The adaptation part was really focused on how do we help countries adapt. So not necessarily setting ambitious targets to reduce fossil fuel emission necessarily, but really like how do we help people who have to move away from their homes because of climate destruction? How do we help people adapt to that? How do we help people adapt to having, huge chunks of their land washed away because of various natural events? So really thinking about like, this is the situation, how do we deal with what's happening right now? Finance was a big part of it also, with the idea being that we being the UN would be more transparent about where the money's coming from, where the money's going, who's getting the money, and what is happening with it. In 2015 at Paris, there was an agreement that countries would collectively contribute annually the equivalent of $100 billion to support developing countries in adaptation. And we've fallen well short of that every year. We're still far, far below that threshold. And so that was seen as a real priority, is figuring out how we're going to make that happen in a really meaningful way. And then to make sure that stakeholders are starting to work more collaboratively rather than just on kind of a country by country basis. So those were the main goals. There were some stumbling blocks that were, some really big, some not so big, but a lot of kind of logistical things that happened that made it a very, very challenging conference. The first and biggest issue, I think, is that Egypt has a pretty horrendous record of human rights. There's a lot of crimes committed against activists, journalists, academics, people who use social media, people who identify as LGBT. I mean, there are all kinds of crimes in Egypt that people are imprisoned for. And the conditions are really pretty deplorable. And so that was a really important thing in my mind to be aware of and to think about how can I go to this conference knowing that it's in this place that is so harmful, so actively harmful? Is it okay? Is it, do I go? Do I not go? I struggled with that a lot. Ultimately, I decided to go and, commit to kind of bearing witness to that and trying to bring some of that back home with me to to help others understand what's happening there. And so I have some resources at the end of this presentation that I would like to share to kind of help people take action and also understand the scope of the situation, because it's really a pretty serious problem. Along those lines, the Egyptian president would not allow for what's called interventions in UN speak. And essentially that's protests and civil action, demonstrations and that kind of thing. And those interventions are really a hallmark of COPs. Again, you know, I talked at the beginning about how the UN really wants COP to be a transparent thing. They really want to include civil society. They really want people to participate and know what's going on, and to also be able to raise their voices and bring attention to the things that matter. And that happens, of course, through civil action. But the Egyptian president wouldn't allow that in or around the conference. There is a separate zone called the Green Zone where different, more less formal events would happen. And theoretically, anybody who wanted to attend events in the Green Zone could do that. I heard from a lot of people that they weren't able to access that area. But if a group wanted to have a protest, they would have had to submit an application to the presidency ahead of time. And then, and by a civil action, I mean a gathering of more than 5 people. They would have had to submit an application ahead of time, and a number of those that were submitted were rejected. So that was a real problem. When that happened, or when word got out that was going on, the UN decided to allow protests and interventions to happen within the UN kind of perimeter, because they recognize the importance of that opportunity for visibility and voice. But that's the first time they've ever allowed that. In years previous to this one, a protest or an intervention like that happening within the UN perimeter would result in a person being ejected from the conference and having their badge taken away. So it's a real shift that the UN made. A couple of other odd things that happened, and odd is an understatement, but there was an atmosphere of surveillance the whole time. Usually the host country creates an app or some kind of digital tool so that people can navigate COP, which would include schedules and maps and various agendas for different things. And about, I guess, the day that so you download the app, then you have all the info. I was sitting in the airport waiting for my plane to fly me out of Minnesota, and I got an alert that the COP27 app was actually spyware. They had confirmed that the app had sort of enabled whoever downloaded it was basically giving access to have their movement tracked, their social media use tracked, their internet use tracked, and everything. So many people wound up deleting the app from their phone. And what that meant was that it became very, very difficult to know what was going on. A lot of, like, the UN has its own agenda and different meetings that you can attend. So there's an app for that. Then each pavilion had its own agenda. So there's an app for that. But there was no sort of central place to find out what was going on or where things were happening. So that was a really unfortunate situation. I mentioned the situation about the hotel prices and the difficulty that a lot of people had just finding lodging. I know that the host country had a real concern about the youth contingent, because there's so many really amazing, incredible youth activists right now, specifically in the climate justice space. And there was a level of scrutiny being applied to young people that was alarming. I talked to a number of young people who traveled to COP, who had reported either being, spontaneously removed from their hotel room with no explanation, having their passports taken for hours at a time, being forced to let somebody inspect their phone, all kinds of really scary things, really intimidating things happening to young people that was unexpected. I don't know if anybody saw, there was quite a lot in the news about that, especially toward the end of COP, because a lot of people were really left in a lurch. So here's some, as I mentioned with the human rights situation, some of the folks that have been in prison, a lot of political activists, climate activists. This man in the right-hand side, he's been in prison, I think, for 9 years, and was on a hunger strike. There were a couple of protests during the conference. He is currently being imprisoned for posting something on social media that was critical of the current president. He wound up being medically sort of revived, and but there were lots and lots of calls for his release during the conference. A number of U.S. representatives and representatives from other countries spoke specifically to the president to try to advocate for him and for other people who have been wrongfully imprisoned, and no progress was made there. So here are a couple of pictures of the protests that happened within the UN, within the conference sort of center. And in this picture, you can't really tell, probably not in this one either. But this is a protest that I was part of. And around the perimeter of this circle of people, there were about 10 people with gigantic machine guns. So it was really, it was a really tense situation. A lot of the security force was there because it's a UN event. And so Egypt really mobilized massive militarization forces to kind of keep the UN area secure. But there was also this sense of like not knowing, you know, what they were concerned about with a protest, or why were suddenly there so many people showing up with weapons around a protest. I mean, there were a lot of really unsettling things about it, but I was really glad to be able to participate and to be there and to bring this back and share it. A couple of the other stumbling blocks were that I mentioned earlier, they didn't actually have an agenda item around specifically reducing fossil fuel emissions, which was just bizarre. They did talk a lot about how we're going to deal with the effects of climate change, how will we adapt and adjust. That seemed to be a bigger focus than how are we going to actually like stop global warming. Some really significant things did happen, though, some really good positive things. I talked about the loss and damage fund. I mean, people have been fighting this for a really, really long time. And they got it. The US was one of the last holdouts who wasn't willing to agree to this, which is embarrassing, I think, as a US citizen, that we were so resistant to that. But in the end, they did. And that's really, really exciting. So essentially now the UN and the UNFCCC, the parties have all agreed that, yep, we need to have funds that are specifically for loss and damage. So climate reparations. And they've established what in kind of creating that as a priority, they've now established a committee, and there are about 24 countries represented on that committee, and they're going to work together to figure out how that funding structure is going to work, who pays in, how much, how the funds get awarded and to whom. That being said, you know, it's worth noting that even though that's a really big deal, it's great that we got that. There is, I think, a very real and very valid concern, particularly among the really vulnerable nations and island states that really are, you know, need this money, deserve this money, that this decision-making committee is potentially going to just reify a lot of colonialism and exploitative practices. So there's a lot of eyes kind of on this process right now, watching to see how is this going to shake out? Are they going to do it right? And another thing that I think is a big concern about this is that those 24 representatives do not include a representative of Indigenous communities. The assumption is that those 24 bodies on that committee will speak for other people. And of course, you know, that doesn't always work out so well. So this is something that's really, people are going to be paying a lot of attention to this over the next year. Another really exciting thing is that for the first time in history, I mean, this is huge. For the first time in history, there's now a UN right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. That's gigantic. Again, the UN agreements coming out of COPs are not legally binding yet. There's some work happening right now to make some of this language actually legally binding. But the fact that this language is in the final document that asserts the human right to a clean, healthy environment is really, really huge. To have that acknowledged and stated as a human right is just gigantic. Food security was also prioritized. It had been talked about quite a bit, but never explicitly prioritized in the documents coming out of COP. And so that's also really good. There's not a ton of detailed language about how exactly countries will prioritize food security. But I think we'll see a lot of movement around that in the next year or so too, because each country is now kind of given some space to really say, yeah, we're going to use some of the resources we have to make sure that we're dealing with food in just ways. So that's really also an exciting thing. Water came out really on top in a lot of ways this time, because we also have language that's really specifically focused on the importance of protecting and conserving water and water ecosystems. We've had a lot of COPs that the final language comes out with stuff about protecting ocean resources, AKA fish and things that we use as resources. But this language really specifically talks about protecting and conserving water, period. And that's a really big deal too, because it's an interesting shift for the UN to be talking about the value of different systems outside of the value that they hold for us as humans. So I think this is really going to lead to some positive changes too for other natural systems. That being said, nature and nature-based solutions got in there too, got into the final language. Forests are still really seen through the lens of how they are resources to humans, as opposed to, you know, their value kind of just because they are. But the fact that they're in there at all is really a big deal. It's really a good shift and a really good change for the UN to be recognizing that. Another thing that's really cool and sort of like sneaky and subversive, but not really, is that when they talk about a work program, so they've agreed to come up with this plan for a just transition. So how are we going to help deal with climate finance, loss and damage? How are we going to deal with the money that's related to this? And the final document, number 55, is the really important stuff. It acknowledges the need for a transformation of the financial system. Now, I'm not totally naive, although some people on this call would probably disagree. I'm not totally naive. I don't think they're going to like overthrow everything and completely change the way we do money in this world. But this is a hugely progressive thing to be saying, that like the systems we've had in place financially haven't really been all that helpful for a lot of the people on this planet. And in order to actually have a just transition, we need to look at that and we need to do something differently. So that's exciting that that was, that made it in there. Some other things, I won't go into too much detail about all these things, but there are a lot of really, really good things that that different countries pledged during the COP. So all kinds of new pledges to protect different ecosystems. The U.S. had a long list of different announcements to make. A lot of them related to the new Inflation Reduction Act. But really talking about some of the great things that are happening at the country level was really very positive, gave me a lot of optimism. And then there were a lot of cool partnerships also. And something else that was exciting that happened was that the US and China agreed to continue talking. That's a first. They've been sort of like chilly toward each other for a couple of years and not talking about climate collaboration, which of course, being two of the top three fossil fuel producing countries, it's kind of been a problem that they haven't been willing to be in the same room together. So the fact that they were willing to talk and collaborate was a big deal. The EU actually pledged to come up with some new, more ambitious targets for cutting emissions. And they were one of the first groups to really say this year, okay, we're going to come back next year and we're going to do better. We're going to increase our ambition. We're going to pledge to do better, and we'll have some specific ideas next year. And then thanks to the new incoming president of Brazil, we have a new partnership between the three largest rainforest nations that are now going to be working together to kind of think about forest preservation and conservation in new ways that haven't been done before. So that's pretty cool. These are some of the big things the US did. I won't read this slide to you because, again, I think it'll be sent out afterwards, or it'll be on the website or something. But there's really been a lot that has happened during the Biden administration around climate. I would say that he's not perfect, but he's really done a lot. And John Kerry, who's the climate envoy for the U.S., so he's kind of our chief negotiator, has really done some positive things. He's done some other unimpressive things, like resisting the loss and damage part, but there have been some really, really good things that the U.S. has done this year. So that was kind of nice to hear about. So I'm including these resources to help connect folks with more information about human rights in Egypt specifically. And then also the UNFCCC has this local community and indigenous peoples platform, which gives some additional information about how specifically the UN wanted to help indigenous peoples and local communities in and around Sharm, where the conference was. So those are some resources that are available to folks after the fact. So that's kind of my spiel. And I'm sure that I left out a bunch of stuff, but I also feel like I've been talking nonstop, so I apologize for that. Are there questions I can answer for folks or comments that people want to share? Oh, I see a chat from Hannah. Can I read it out loud, Hannah? It's with all the new space missions happening in various countries, was there any discussion of limiting the amount of emissions or launches done by a given country or protocols for collecting debris? That is an awesome question, and I don't know. I didn't hear of anything like that. And I didn't see a big presence from NASA. Actually, I don't remember hearing much at all about space or space exploration, but I would be really surprised if someone wasn't thinking about it. And I will be thinking about that going forward because I bet there's something there. Yeah. Patty, do you want to unshare your screen? Yes, thank you. Okay. I think I'm unsharing my screen now, am I?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I get so worried on these calls, like, What am I
Great.
sharing and what aren't I? Okay, so I'm going to pause my mic and drink water.
Patty, that was awesome.
Thank you, Suzanne.
So it was so informative.
Oh, well, thanks.
Yeah.
I feel like I learned so much. And when I was there, kind of in the thick of it, I didn't, it's more like just taking it all in and then having some time to sort of process and let it percolate. That was really, really good for me. It was such a whiplash of emotions. And I felt that at COP26 too, of like the highs and lows every day were just exhausting. Like I remember this year, I don't know if everyone here is familiar with Dr. Robert Bullard, but he's like considered to be the father of environmental justice in this country. I mean, he's like a hugely important person, like, and I was just like fangirling so hard because he was there and I saw him multiple times a day and I got to say hi to him like in person. And, I mean, I was just so excited. And then, 2 hours later, I would be at a presentation learning about, like the sheer number of corals that are dying so quickly and how are we going to, and so it was just like up and down and up and down. And it really took me a few days to kind of sort of sit with all of that. Part of it was top secret meetings. And then after those meetings, then they work on the language for the final final document. And usually COP kind of runs into overtime. So it's supposed to end on the Friday of the second week. And usually there's like hours of time where they're fighting over this or that word. This year, they went all the way up through Sunday of the following weekend because there were some things that they just could not make headway on. And ultimately they did make some progress on that final language, but there were some things that didn't make it in that were baffling that they weren't in there. Last year, one of the big sticking points was the term phasing out versus phasing down. So in the final language at COP26, there was a kind of a recommendation that countries started out as being phase out inefficient coal use. No, phasing out coal use, period. In the end, that language got changed to phasing down inefficient coal use, which obviously contains quite, it's pretty subjective when you use those new words for it. But those are the kinds of things that happened this year too. People were really, really hopeful that the final agreement that came out with the final language would have something more specific about phasing out fossil fuel or even phasing down fossil fuel. And the language, I think, is now phasing down inefficient fossil fuel. So again, it's pretty benign language that can be, I guess, manipulated how one sees fit. But those are the kinds of things that last for hours. People will just, as we've all done in meetings where we're wordsmithing documents together, imagine 198 people wordsmithing a document. It can be really onerous, but in the end, there were a lot of good steps made. So a couple of questions that are coming through the chat. What are the most important things that we at Hamline can do right now to support the climate? I love that question. One of them just happened, and that's vote. That is probably the biggest top number one thing that people can do is vote, and vote for every single office you can. There are a lot of individual choices that we can make, which matter and help us to be consistent with our values, but really the system has got to change. And the way that we do that is through voting and through civil action, quite frankly. I think other things that we can do at Hamline, things that we could do would be one of the things that the US government just did was create a requirement that all of its vendors had a pledge to reduce emissions. Hamline may or may not do something like that. We could add more green space, add more native plants to campus, do more to kind of add biodiversity to the green little island that we have here in the city. That would really matter a lot. And I think really part of what we really need is to just keep talking about it. I kind of eat, sleep, and breathe climate. And so I'm always surprised that other people aren't that immersed in the world of climate change. But the more we talk about it and the more we sort of acknowledge all the feelings that we have about it and all the questions and stuff, the more we really normalize that. And I think even though that's not a super tangible thing we can do, I think that really will help us as a community to kind of process where we're at and be generative in thinking about what we can do as opposed to being reactive. Because I think a lot of times when it comes to climate stuff, we hear about all the problems and we get really upset and almost, frozen with anxiety or being overwhelmed. And that happens because we're also really isolated. And so by talking to other people and communicating and sharing our feelings about climate, questions, ideas, and all of that, we really extend our community. And I think that by doing that, we start to create positive changes in a lot of ways. And of course, all the other stuff is important too, like recycling and reducing single-use plastics and trying to reduce your own use of fossil fuels. All that stuff is important. So all of those things matter, but I think really just like remembering that we're in a community together, all of us, and we need each other so much. And this work is not something anyone can do alone. And the situation isn't something any of us can really sit with on our own. We have to have other connections with people in order to process all of this. I also think that at Hamline, we can also really provide our students with a lot of experiences and opportunities to think about how climate connects to the work that we all do. No matter what job you have, it's a climate related job in some form or another. And I think that we could really do a lot to kind of send that message out to our community here. Because I think we owe it to our students to make sure that everybody's prepared and has a lot of resources and a real sense of being rooted in a community here among people who really believe and are hopeful for the future. Okay, I'm just scrolling through the questions on the side. With my teacher educator lens, what came up at the conference regarding education and anything regarding teacher education? I love that question. Thank you, Patsy. Last year, there was a big meeting of the ministers of environment and education, and I was able to attend that. That was so great. There were 45 countries represented. The US was not represented. But every country that was there made a pledge to integrate climate literacy in their national curricula in one form or another. And I was so excited about that. You all who you know me have known that I've been like wishing for that for so long. I think if we don't embed it in education at every single level, we're really, really missing a huge opportunity. The more people know, the more power they have. And the more people know, the more ways they can get engaged and do things. And so I really feel strongly that we need to be thinking about this in every single discipline, and specifically teacher education, I think, is the best place really to embed climate literacy, because we've got these generations of kids who really deserve to feel hopeful and feel a sense of agency and feel like the stuff they do matters, because it does. And as teachers, we need to be prepared to support that. And so I think inside teacher education, we really need to be kind of recognizing the role of climate in every discipline and helping our teachers see the connections across every single discipline at every single grade. And I think that's hard. That's a pretty hard thing to do, but I think it's totally doable. And I think that it's getting back to the idea that I brought up earlier about how talking about climate normalizes climate and the climate situation. I think that we are so far past the point where climate can be thought of as a political thing that I think we have to just leave that behind. It's not political. It is what it is. And, we have to just deal with it. And so I think that's something that we really need to communicate as well. We have many accolades and appreciation coming. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. And Marcella is asking if Russia participated. Yes, they did. They didn't have a country pavilion. So there weren't a lot of, at least if they did, I couldn't find it. It was very difficult to find one's way around. And I know that they were in some of the negotiations because there was a comment made unironically about Russia saying we couldn't do more to contribute to the energy problem. So there was a little bit of I don't know, discordant things happening there, but they were there. They were definitely there. If there are any other questions, that's all that's in the chat question wise. So I don't know if things came in on the other format, but thanks for all the nice comments.
On the other platform, about if you could say a little bit more about the loss and damage, like what are people imagining that this fund, how will it get used? I realize all the details haven't been figured out, but from what you've heard, could you say a little bit?
An example that I've heard of, and one of the people who's super outspoken about this is, a lot of small island states are really outspoken about this naturally because a lot of them are having to evacuate their homes or move to higher ground and completely change their way of life as a result of climate change. I think what a lot of people are imagining will happen with this money is that the money will help kind of help with rebuilding in sustainable ways. It will help with if people do choose to relocate, it will help with that. It would help with rebuilding infrastructure or supporting sustainable life ways that are being threatened by climate change. So if a region or a community within a region has to move and that threatens, let's say, the number of native language speakers in that area, how are we going to make sure that people growing up in that place still have access to their language? So things like that. And I think the hope is that the loss and damage fund will be something that countries will have a lot of sort of leeway over so that countries can use that money. I mean, that's the intention, is that they'll be able to use that money in the ways that make the most sense for that specific country in that specific setting and those specific conditions. And I really do think that the world is really cognizant of the need for that to be in place, for countries to have agency to use that money and not be told what to do or how to do it or what should be done. Again, that's that idea of transforming the financial system. Like, we, the US, we don't get to decide how Barbados uses their loss and damage money. They get to decide that. And so there's so many people who are really going to be paying a lot of attention to make sure that when those mechanisms are created, they're equitable and just, as much as, people are really fighting like hell for that. And I think that it will have a positive result.
Well, thank you so much. We're so appreciative for the advocacy you've brought to including climate. As many of you know, Fatty has built the climate literacy program here at Hamline and has really helped us in environmental studies, where I'm situated in anthropology, to thinking about teaching climate and future studies as part of what we do, which have been transforming our curriculum to do. So much appreciation for your connection and for bringing it back to us. And here's to making progress before the next COP. And if there are any final questions, we do have a couple more minutes, but thank you all for joining us in the meantime.
Yeah, I just really want to say a huge thank you to Hamline for letting me go and be there, for supporting me in so many ways. I feel like this is, it's super emotional, but such a huge privilege and an honor to be able to go and represent Hamline in this context. And then just to come back to a place like this where people care so deeply really feels really good. And I'm so grateful to many folks here at Hamline for making sure that it was going to be possible for me to do this. So I'm super grateful, and I'm super grateful to the Center for Justice and Law for focusing on climate justice this year. I'm so excited about that and thrilled to be able to have been a part of it.
And it's part of our understanding of environmental justice. So I will say in conclusion also that we are really appreciative of Hamline Environmental Education Project and to the work that they've been doing parallel to this. And